Good Shepherd Sunday, together with those churches following the so-called consensus lectionary was recognized last week. That is celebrating something of the Spirit of Christ guiding us in our lives as a shepherd would guide his sheep. This theme was somewhat consumed by the coincidence of Mother's Day and Christian Family Sunday, so I thought I might take the liberty of revisiting it a little today. Christ, as that famous benediction pronounces, that great shepherd of the sheep, and we are the sheep of his pasture. But most of us think the potential of ourselves being sheep-like as a largely undesirable possibility of human existence. It would seem obvious that our culture focuses on, encourages, and even more generously rewards those who have more of the characteristics of leaders than followers. We know perhaps too well of that proverbial threat of the sheep being led to the slaughter, or as they say, down the ominous garden path. Being a sheep in our society is all but celebrated. But there are merits to understanding wherein we are and perhaps ought to be sheep-like. As some of you know, a few years ago, a portion of our family traveled to England. I remember renting a car at Heathrow Airport, and this being only the second time that I had driven a car on the left side of the road, I knew I had some adapting to do. In my own defense, the plane had landed at what was for me 5 a.m. And so I was a little tired. My wife and I and our 2 children loaded our luggage in, and initially I got along just fine, driving on the appropriate side of the road. But I kept on going around and coming back into the airport arrivals area just as I thought I was leaving, over and over and over again. Clearly, my own leadership wasn't getting me anywhere, as my family were not shy about sharing with me. I guess growingly bored of the sights they were repeatedly seeing, they knew I was somehow missing the appropriate turnout. So amidst some frustration, it then popped into my head that maybe I could follow one of the buses out, knowing full well that it was unlikely they, with 40-odd passengers aboard, could afford to go in circles like me. And so I followed a diesel bus, and it led us straight out onto a highway ramp where we promptly saw signs of our recognizable destinations and happily continued on our trip through England. Much as it seems to go against the grain, as we all know, often better things come from following others than leading ourselves. But as we also know, it is not advisable to follow just anyone who happens to come along. We need to be discerning about what power or authority or person is going to lead us. It is not good, for instance, to follow someone who is as confused as you are, or perhaps as lost, or perhaps up to no good. You can't follow just any old bus. I was rather lucky. It may be better or more effective to follow one and not another. In short, following, or to use the religious and Christian term, being a disciple does have the potential of being a very good thing in life, but only if the leader is going somewhere worth going to, and preferably someone who knows the best way to get there. Now, when it comes to leadership, what do we think of? Don't we think of politicians, of heads of businesses and grand organizations, big and small, of those that have great resources and can profoundly affect the direction of public policy and societal conditions generally. Wealthy individuals, perhaps. Sometimes we think of people who have a wealth of knowledge. Sometimes people with the power of persuasion, people with a lot of charisma. We may be most inclined to be reminded of the leaders that dominate the front pages of our newspapers, and in turn be easily given over to wondering if anyone can really lead our society. Is anyone really a good shepherd of our resources among the people in our midst? When we consider the features of character or behavior of leaders down through history to the present day, we might well wonder, are there any good shepherds among us? Can anyone really lead? With all due respect to various people, some of you might recall, like me, during the presidency of Ronald Reagan, wondering or pondering the absurdity of a Hollywood actor turned politician whose passion for jelly beans was placed side by side with his views concerning important issues like nuclear disarmament and the fall of the then Soviet Union. Or to go further back to that famous Winston Churchill, whose biography suggests that some of his most inspired decisions came as he sat in a bath with a cigar and a glass of brandy. Then there is the circus, or should I say, the saga of the current mayor of Toronto. Not to put these on the same level, clearly something very odd is going on of which no one seems to be in control. These three are from the political world, but it links up with a multitude of other areas of life, including that which is religious. It is not unimportant for us to understand the ways power have been and the way power has been and is executed in our society. Recently in the United Kingdom, the relatively new Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, weighed in on the British Prime Minister David Cameron's insinuation that there was reason to feel confident and reassured about Britain's status as a Christian country. That the whole ethical and legal foundation of the country was very much rooted in Christian principles. And so nonetheless, the Archbishop was gratified that the Prime Minister was talking about religious things at all in the public sphere. But this raised the ire of others, apparently most especially the humanists, who do not agree with the notion of the country's political institutions being of a religious orientation. But even in the face of this opposition, the Archbishop said that, and I quote, "The Christian faith is much more vulnerable to comfortable indifference than to hatred and opposition, as evidenced by empty pews across the nation." Is it any different in Canada? Most of us would like to think that our justice system, our public education, our public ethical stances, and even our public institutions have something of a religious consciousness and presence within them. That, however, may not be a warranted conclusion. If you look at political figures at practically every level, it is generally something of a taboo for candidates to reflect on their religious background, should it happen to be a well-cultivated one, which in most cases it would seem not. The religions of our leaders are viewed almost as secrets, as personal aspects of private lives, which should have minimal effect on what they say or do publicly. And yet this would seem to distance us from the truth. If you want to understand a politician, check out and see who is their God. Who or what is most valuable to them? Money and property, or integrity and truth? What do they hold? Is it what they hold in their hand, or what they believe in their heart. The moral compass of our society, our sense of right and wrong, determines not just where we are going, but how we treat people. This is what our courts and lawyers and judges argue for and about. And let's face it, most of our politicians are from the legal profession. We might nonetheless ask, where is leadership coming from? Parliament Hill? The Houses of Parliament in London? The White House? The Congress? The political assemblies in nations across the world? Some or all of these? Probably not, as surprising as that may seem to many of us. After all, these institutions are vested with the responsibility of leading us, though, aren't they? They get paid a lot of money to do so, and they're a little more careful about their expenses nowadays, aren't they? Well, if it isn't exclusively or even primarily within political institutions, where does real power and authority reside in our society? Perhaps in our schools, in our teachers and professors and researchers and writers, or perhaps in other institutions, perhaps from other public places like hospitals. After all, something like 1/3 of public funds are spent in the area of healthcare. Do they not sometimes determine literally if we live or die? Now, I am all for taking care of people's health, don't get me wrong, but it's good for us to understand where a great deal of monetary power is exerted, and it has a political aspect. Speaking of money, maybe we should look at the banks. After all, everybody turns to them to get certain things that seem to be rather important. Maybe the banks are in charge. Maybe the power resides in the newest and fastest growing areas of our modern consciousness, the internet, and those in control of information systems. That big electronic brain that seems to be growing with the consciousness of all the little details of us all. Well, it is one thing to talk about where the power is, and quite another thing to talk about in whom real and good leadership exists. An Oscar-winning movie called The Lady in Number 6, Music Saved My Life, is an inspiring 38-minute long film which consists of an interview of a 109-year-old Jewish lady named Alice Hertz Sommer, who was a concert pianist who survived the Holocaust. She was interviewed in her retirement residence in London, England, where I think she recently passed away, very recently. But at 109, she played the piano beautifully. Bach and Beethoven and other composers, and in between she reflected on her journey in life, including when the Nazi regime moved in and took her grand piano. Nazi officers had moved into the, apartment block in which she had lived, and they had noticed her playing stopped. And they came to her door and they complained that they couldn't hear her beautiful music anymore. Having already taken her husband, the regime then moved her and their only son to a location where the Nazis produced films to pretend to the outside world how well they were treating the Jewish population, right next to Auschwitz. And so even here, she was fortunate enough to escape into the realm of music, which for her, she said, was God. The one way her spirit was never to be incarcerated or even threatened with annihilation. Incredibly, even in reflecting upon her captors and the blackest aspects of those horrible years, she encouraged seeing the joy of life. She was one happy lady, really hard to believe. If you haven't seen this movie, I commend it to you. Music, literature, the creative mind can lead us into the most wonderful realms of human experience and life on this earth, in spite of what may be going on all around us. They can lead us from the most depressing and condemning aspects of existence into the most beautiful, the loveliest, dare I say, the most divine. Sure, the big, powerful institutions, our banks and hospitals and schools and political assemblies have their place and even their extraordinary value at times, but they are only as valuable as the virtues of the good-spirited people who come within them. And we depend on them. Now, I've left church out here, not so much by design, but perhaps by habit. For is this not what happens with our whole society? The church is increasingly not part of the habits of people today. It used to be, when it was recognized as the hub of life in many ways. Now, by many accounts, it's been relegated to a mere smoke. I guess I shouldn't laugh. Therein lies a major problem with society, failing to see wherein we ought to be truly led. All of the other powers of which I've spoken have a certain self-interest. The bank's bottom line is not necessarily in your best interests, but it's in its own profit. Hospitals and schools literally compete with one another for public dollars, not always resulting in the best public service. In many instances, some of the most highly paid people in society are busy trying to convince some of the most powerful and often wealthiest among us of their particular requirements. Political leadership, as we know, is not only not to be taken on by the faint-hearted, but evidently not by the non-millionaire, or should I say non-billionaire in many cases. The church and its leadership is intended to be an exception to all of this, as led by the most impoverished among us, Christ himself. That great shepherd of the sheep who had no lawyer pleading his case, no doctor tending to his wounds, no wealthy benefactor reassuring him of resources to be later put at his disposal, no lobby group behind the cross upon which he had been placed. Christ was totally unlike any of those groups. He revealed to us instead a power and leadership that arose out of something much deeper. Something not about taking care of himself, but of giving totally to others. This would be considered corporate suicide in organizations, political and otherwise today, but it is of that creative spirit that makes this world a truly better place. Surely none of us, but only God could do this. But if we must, ought we not to look to human leaders who are not the wealthiest among us, but the most Christ-like? Not people who wear their religion on their sleeve, necessarily, but those whose behavior reveals a love that is in their heart. Before we elect or follow after anyone, shouldn't we know why they have come into relationship with us? What motivates them? I always do that when I'm coming next to somebody. I say, what do they want from me? We should really ask, what can I give to them? Is this for them, or for me, or for both of us, or for someone else? We need to understand that. It's often hard to know. At various times in our lives, clearly we are all like Thomas, saying, Lord, we do not know where we are going. How can we know the way? And Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you know me, you will know my Father also. From now on, you do know him, and you have seen him. We have no need to go round and round in circles, we can follow that great great shepherd. That great shepherd of the sheep. And oh, what a wonderful journey it lay ahead.